In today's lesson, we are going to look at bending and laminating timber. First of all, what we have is in wood technology, we do from time to time have projects that we need to bend wood to a certain curve. Now, this might be for functional reasons, and then other ones is for aesthetics. Now, aesthetics would be to make the item look a lot better. So what we have here is we've two projects down here. One is done for aesthetic reasons and the other one is done for functional reasons. So you have to look at these and wonder which one is done for a functional reason and then one is done for aesthetics to make it look better. Now, methods of bending and laminating timber. Now, there are several methods. First of all, we can go with solid wood curve. So the leg or the feet of this table here is made from solid wood. So it can be made one piece of wood and just cut the waste material off of it. Second method then is when we go and we steam bend timber. So we put it into a chamber with steam, soften the timber and then bend it into shape. Third is we do a whole range of saw cuts on a piece of wood, which is called kerfing. And what we do is we glue it into the new shape then with all this material removed. Fourth is laminating. So laminating is where we get very thin pieces of wood and glue them all together to make curves. Next then we have plywood lamination. So that's where we get thin sheets of plywood and we glue them together to form curves on items. And then finally, we have flexi-ply. So flexi-ply is a very flexible birch ply. It's a very thin layer of plywood. Now, looking at solid wood curve. So, for example, what we have here is we have the feet of the table again. So, and this time we've made out 3 pieces of timber. So what you notice in the first instance here, the grain has split going across the way because the grain is going across the way, so the leg is going to break on the table because the grain is very narrow in that section. Second one, the grain is vertical, so the grain is going to snap up along again the shortest direction. And the third example then is where we have the grain in this longest position possible, and what we have is there's no crack in it. Now, that doesn't say that it won't break over time. For example, if we look at the real toe of the down here of the feet, that piece here could snap off because it's very short grain here and short grain here. What we're looking at here is when we're making this, there is quite a lot of time in shaping the pieces of wood because you have to mark out these pieces of wood and then cut out the pieces. So if we look at this here, we have the marks done on the raw materials. Then what we're looking at is removing all this waste material and then we're finished with the end curve. Now, there is quite a lot of waste material in this process. Here we have steam bending. Now, when we want to do steam bending, we have to place pieces of wood in a steam box. The diagram down here shows a steam box made at home, where it's made out of scrap pieces of timber. We have a kettle plugged in here, which will produce the steam. The steam enters the box, where we have doors on the side here. Now, the reason why we use steam is steam helps to soften the timber. So as the timber heats up, the fibres in the timber get soft. Then when we take out the piece of timber out of the steam box, we're able to bend it around a former. So what we have in the second diagram here is a former with 2 F clamps holding the bent piece of timber in the shape until the piece of timber cools down and stays in that shape. Now, when you're steam bending, the woods that are good for steam bending would be ash, oak, yew, beech and elm. They're the most suitable ones for bending. Now, there's certain woods that should be avoided. For example, in the woodwork room, you shouldn't use red deal because there's too many knots in it, and what tends to happen is the wood tends to break along the knots. Now, when you're doing this, time has to be allowed for the steam to penetrate through the timber. So it takes quite a lot of time for the steam bending process to take place, and especially if you have to bend several pieces of timber. Now, there's no real waste produced in the steam bending in this method here. because what you're doing is you're taking a solid piece of timber and you're bending it around a former. So the only waste that would be produced is the former, but if you're using the former several times for several pieces, it's not that wasteful and it can be stored and kept for more steam bending in the future. Now, the formers are made up here using a female section and a male section, and the space in the middle there is for the piece of wood to be bent into the shape. Next we have kerfing. Kerfing is a method of bending also, but this is where we cut pieces away. So what we have up here is we have a piece of wood that is bent around a centre piece of a dark piece of wood, and to create the bends what we do here is we cut slots out of the piece of wood, but we don't cut fully through, so we leave a small bit of wood left in the piece. So what it is, this is more suitable for use with plywood materials and MDF when we want to bend them around something like, we'll say, a hardwood piece here. Now, diagram here shows how it's done in greater detail. So what we tend to do here is we tend to do the cuts down along the piece of wood, then we put glue into these cuts, and then we place the piece of wood into a former, and then what we have is once the glue dries in, the piece of wood stays in this shape. Now, the waste that's produced this time is just from all the saw cuts. The disadvantage of this method is you actually see all the saw cuts, so it's an idea to cover over the end of the piece of wood with maybe a veneer to hide all these saw cuts. Next, we have laminating. Laminating involves bending 10 strips of material, either hot or cold. So if we're doing it hot, we might use steam bending again to help soften the actual laminates themselves. Now, each thin laminates are glued together and to form these curved shapes. Now, when you take a piece of wood, you get a very skinny piece of wood, maybe 3 to 4 mils, it's quite easy to bend on its own. So this process involves us taking maybe 7, 8, 9 pieces of timber, 10 strips of wood, putting glue in between each of the layers, and then putting it into a formwork. And as the glue sets, then what it is, we take off the clamps and then it stays in its new shape. Now, the only disadvantage of laminating is there is quite a lot of waste produced, because first of all we have to create all these laminates. So these laminates are either created on tables or a bandsaw. Then after you laminate something together, it's not always possible to get the edges matching up perfectly smooth. So what we have in the diagram here is we have a smoothing plane here, or a jack plane, used to plane the edges of the timber nice and smooth afterwards. Now, it is quite time consuming when you're doing laminating, because of all the pieces have to be cut, then glued, and then we have to wait overnight for the pieces to dry, and then probably plane down the edges of them.
For furniture, a lamination is often going to be the best way to go. The reasons being is you can use any type of wood, you can get almost any type of bend, and there's no seasonal movement issues. The cons are that usually you have to make a male and a female piece for the jig, and also that there's a lot of cleanup to do with the glue joint, so that can be a little tricky. In this video I used yellow glue, but if I was doing this with a more complex bend, I would use Unibond because it's stronger and has a longer open time. Steam bending is going to give you a very clean result. It's going to be the cleanest of all of them. And it's a lot of fun to do too. The drawbacks are that you have restricted to certain species of woods. You have to make a steam box, which is no big deal. You're going to want one anyway. But there's also seasonal movement issues. So it's going to expand more in the summer, and it's going to shrink in the winter. Often, if you have an open bend like this, you want to connect them together, so there's less movement issues seasonally. With a kerf bend I really don't use much for furniture. The reason being that structurally it's not as strong. Might as well just make a lamination and be able to put joinery into any part of it. But you can use this, it's fun, it's very quick to do. Usually you would use it in a carpentry job if you're doing some type of curved art, or you can imagine a stage and a curved stage. That'd be a very quick, easy way to do it.
Plywood laminating. Plywood is also an ideal material for laminating. Thin plywood between 3 to 4 mils can be used and bent into shapes easily. Since plywood is a manufactured board, it's a good choice in terms of sustainability. So what we have here is, we have this chair here that's made in this intricate shape here using plywood. The only negative about using plywood for laminating process is the edge detail here, all the way along the edge here, will be visible. So you'll have layers then of where the plywood has joined onto each other. So it's a good idea to maybe run a veneer over the edge of the actual chair here. Next we have FlexiPly. So FlexiPly is a flexible manufactured board that can be easily bent by hand. So in this case you wouldn't need formers to actually bend it into these shapes. So what we have here is just a picture of what the FlexiPly looks like, made from birch plywood, and it's only about 3 mils in thickness. Now all the grain is going in the same direction, unlike plywood. Now it's the most flexible material that you can use for making these intricate shapes here. So all these projects here are made using FlexiPly.